want you to bring your perspective of the energy sector on this subsidy removal and its impact on e-hailing, if you have. Help us, please, unpack the broader performance of the energy sector post-subsidy. Post-subsidy, what has happened to the energy sector? And the interesting conversation on the progress we have made on the CNG initiative. If there is progress there, if it's retrogression, if it is stability, I don't know. And then help me. Maybe I'll come back with the third one. I wanted to ask you about the roadmap towards the future. But let's hear your thoughts on the broader performance of the energy sector post-subsidy and that CNG initiative.
Thank you. The energy sector, I believe, became better liberalized post-subsidy.
Okay.
The opportunities widened because that's what happens when you liberalize a market, when you reduce regulation and you allow the market to thrive on its own credit. You see more investments coming. You see more investments in infrastructure, more investments in products, because now pricing is literally left to the forces of demand and supply. Market forces would determine, pricing. Interestingly, what you would have expected would be some kind of contraction in volume sold, but there was no such contraction because the need was still the need.
Yes.
And that's helped. It's helped largely because we've been talking about deregulation for the last 2 to 3 decades. And the anchor of the argument had always been to empower the market so that you have more investments come into the market, helping with infrastructure development, and now we're seeing that post subsidy removal. It's also led to some form of creativity, because those who have been promoting CNG for transportation purposes will refer to what they're doing as being creative. Well, it's literally being wise in half. So we've seen growth in the adoption of CNG for mobility. Recently, the federal government released a number that's, almost $400 million investments gone into CNG powered vehicles for mobility. When they started the program about a year ago, they had 7 conversion centers. Now they have over 200 centers nationwide. It continues to grow. They claim that about 3,000 people have been trained in the sector. So it's booming, right? But that's not what we should be doing with CNG today.
Talk to me. What should we be doing with it?
There are countries all over the world, that have been powering their transportation with CNG for very many years, and they're now pivoting to electric, or perhaps even biofuel. It's 2025 and we're raving about CNG for transportation. And I understand the thinking. It's premised on the fact that we're an oil-rich or gas-rich nation.
Yes.
We should be powering most of our, requirements, whether it's transportation or, anything
gas,
else,
yes.
Using the gas that we have.
Yes.
After all, we're still flaring on one hand, we're injecting on the other, and our gas commercialization, agenda is progressing, but, not as quickly as, we would want it to be. So let's power transportation with CNG, particularly now that subsidy for refined petroleum has been removed.
Yes.
Right? It sounds,
logical.
Like it makes sense.
Yes.
Right? It's just that the infrastructure required to democratize the delivery of CNG at that retail level that will help the transportation sector expand is not there. we've not invested in it for the last 3, 4, 5 decades. The question then begs, should we start investing in that infrastructure today?
Why not?
Right? Why not? Why not is, one, we've signed up to net zero by 2060. CNG-based transportation does not move you to net zero by 2060. It regresses you, right? And that's because maybe people fail to understand that whilst diesel may be dirtier than gas and petrol dirtier than gas, gas is still dirty. It's not clean.
Okay.
All right? So I had an interesting conversation with a very senior government official asking about how we can help them with carbon credits for the CNG program. And when I said you can't get carbon credits for CNG, the alarm on his face troubled me because it meant that they had no idea.
Yeah.
All right? That's one. Secondly, we're not saying that CNG has no role in transportation. What we're saying is that rather than for CNG to be powering vehicles, CNG should be powering charging stations, charging infrastructure. But let us leapfrog to electric vehicles.
Okay.
Right? Because that's the future, and that future is here. And it will only get cheaper as battery technology gets better, more proliferated, the cost will come down, and then you'll be able to compete favorably on the asset side with its ICE counterparts, whether it's running on petrol or CNG.
Yeah.
So that money that we're spending today on setting up conversion centers that I bet you will go moribund within the next decade. It's not a curse.
The next decade.
It's just a projection.
Okay.
Right? Those centers will be moribund within the next decade. That money we're putting in CNG conversion centers should be invested in charging infrastructure, because charging infrastructure is the next downstream sector for mobility. It's just the sector that would dispense electricity instead of diesel or petrol.
Okay.
That's what we should be looking at today. But I guess it was a reactive measure to the removal of subsidy, right? And looking at how to cushion the effect of that. But if you look back over the last 18 months or 2 years thereabouts since the subsidy was removed, we haven't seen any respite because of the introduction of CNG in transportation. But if we had invested that money in infrastructure for charging, we will see the respite.
Yeah.
Because electric vehicles have no engines, they have about 20 moving parts as against 2,000 moving parts of the internal combustion engine counterparts, which means you spend less on maintenance, which then means that over time, the cost of transportation will drop if you go electric. Now, the other reason I say that it's been wise by half, introducing CNG is because in 2022, we released an energy transition plan that we published to the world, committing to electrifying all public transport in Nigeria by 2060. We released that in 2022, and by 2024, was it 2023, we changed course and started, going CNG. That is one of the issues you find, and I'm sure perhaps he will speak to it, when it comes to attracting investment into the country. The policy is not enough. The behavior of the government is extremely important, because when you release one policy on one hand and you do something else on the other, that inconsistency discourages investments in the economy. So, but in the private sector, we see the need to go electric. We'll continue to lead the charge. And as usual, government will catch up at some point.
I like that. Government will catch up because the private is seeing the future. I like what you said about the CNG conversion centers going moribund, but I also see an opportunity there. I'm sure they can always be proposed to become charging stations, isn't it? What then is that roadmap? You talked about Nigeria has a net zero ambition. What do you think should be our roadmap towards achieving that?
Well, I mean, within the purview of transportation, we just need to stick to the commitment in the energy transition plan, which is to electrify all public transportation in Nigeria by 2060, right? And it's got to be multimodal, right? Rail, waterways, roads, whatever it is, right? And that's what you see happening in Lagos. So Lagos is dedicating certain areas to electric transportation. They're referred to as green corridors.
Yes.
Where you have electric-powered rail system,
yeah.
running through and out of those districts. You have, they have a plan to ensure that even for road, the buses are all electric, the taxi vehicles are all electric. So, and that's, you take it from one small district and you amplify that across the geographies, not only in Lagos, but across the country. What we need is that discipline to stay focused and put our money where our mouth is. One of the things you find, when the investor says, I've got money, I hear that a lot. And then you meet the entrepreneur who says, I've got an idea. And then you begin to wonder, what's missing? Why aren't these guys creating magic? Right? There's a guy here who has money, there's a guy here who has a great idea, but magic is not happening. It's that you find that upstream capital is not as available as it should be. And what upstream capital does is it proves the technology or it proves the concept. So the entrepreneur needs to design the project, come up with the fund, oftentimes equity, to test the concept. And when it's proven, the money man scales it up.
Yeah.
Right? And we need to, so the future is electric, however you look at it. Layered on top of electric is hydrogen, gas. So there's still a role for gas, powering vehicles. I believe that in the future it's going to be hydrogen.
Okay.
Again, as the pricing of hydrogen makes sense, you will see more hydrogen-powered vehicles. Today, it doesn't quite make commercial sense. And then you see biofuels, right? That's where it's going. But what's going to turn all of this on its head is technology. The day someone comes up with a device that is the size of your iPad, right? And what that device does is it sits between combustion and emission. That's a tailpipe.
Yes.
And it strips the gas of all things carbon, releasing clean air into the environment. Then refined petroleum is here to stay. That's what it means. It means internal combustion engine vehicles are not going anywhere. Because the issue is the emission.
That's right.
So if I find a way to strip that combustion of carbon and release clean air, then technology has solved the problem. So technology has a role to play. And I often say, this particular technology is not far-fetched. It exists today. It's just at a scale that is industrial. That's the carbon capture technology. And the fact that it's currently industrial does not mean it's not going to become more modular, much smaller in the future. And a reference point for that is computer. When you look at the computer systems in the 50s and 60s, you have the IBM mainframes that sat at the basement of large institutions, where people would go to, operate them, and they were trained specially. What those large machines could do at that time is like 2% of what your phone can do today.
Right now.
Right? So technology has a role to play, and oil-producing countries must begin to look at investing in R&D for creating this kind of technology that literally just decarbonizes internal combustion engine systems, right? So there's a possibility for that, and I see it happening. It may take 20 years, it may take 30 years, but the bottom line is the journey will then end up being, what is it that we say? It's an energy mix, right?
Yes.
So even for mobility, it's going to be an energy mix. If that technology comes, right, it means internal combustion engine vehicles are here to stay because we can now burn refined petroleum safely. But it doesn't in any way then invalidate the use of electric vehicles or hydrogen-powered vehicles or biofuels. It's going to be a mix as well.
The economic power of the movers or users or riders is not being considered in this conversation. With all of these investments, how do you help the riders?
What you do if you don't recognize or take into consideration the economic powers of the movers, you create a business that is outside the market, right? It's the economic powers of the movers that actually define your model, and just basically set the tone for what you do. However, in consideration of that economic power, we're reintroducing and glorifying rideshare, right? Because it's not new. We've been ride-sharing since forever, when those taxis will just stop, pick you up, stop, pick the next guy, but safety happened, and anyways, a whole lot of things. But now we've reintroduced it, and that's so that movers can continue to move in recognition of the economic power. That's one. There are also other alternatives, all right? Tumi spoke earlier about 1,000 buses doing $500 million a year revenue, and that was the same thing 300 taxi vehicles were doing in a month. That is largely because these buses have fares that are regulated.
Yeah.
They're much cheaper. So you will see movers who used to be able to afford taxi hailing service now moving to
buses.
Mass transit using buses. Because in some environments we find government subsidizing some of these things. But when we hail government for removing subsidy on petroleum products, are we going to ask them to then move that cost to subsidizing movement itself, mobility? So the market has to morph. We need to give the market time to morph, right? But the businessman, whether it's a capital provider, the entrepreneur, the operations guy, the bottom line is we are all focused on the economic strength
of the people. Does Oando fund R&D for prototyping new solutions? I was going to say no to the person, but I don't work for you. So.
No. We do not invest in new technology until tested and proven. So we absolutely do not invest in R&D, not today. We're not capitalized to be able to afford that.
Okay. Someone wants to know what your plans for charging infrastructure is. Do you have plans for it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's not so visible yet.
Because the battery technology that you find in vehicles today are designed in cycles. It's a grid skeleton. The amount of times you charge your vehicle, aka the battery, determines the longevity of the battery's life. So you don't want to build a transport system that's sitting, particularly public transport, that's sitting on opportunistic charging. What do I mean by that? The taxi driver has no demand at the moment. He's at 48% battery charge. And he thinks, well, I'm waiting, let me just go and charge. And then he charges to 82%, and then he gets a call. So he goes to do it. And then by the time he returns, he's at 61. And I say, yeah, where was I? I was charging. Then he goes again to charge. You will diminish the lifespan of that battery. And the cost of the battery is somewhere between 35 to 45% of the cost of the vehicle. So what you want to do is design a charging infrastructure that ensures that your vehicles are charged at most once a day. What that then means is, as you roll out vehicles for public transportation, you build charging depots. I was having a conversation with him before we started the session, and we're looking at putting chargers at strategic locations across Lagos. And we just, considered looking at certain locations in Yaba, right, that he has, purview over. That's how we're going to build charging infrastructure. You're not going to see it by the roadside,
station, yes.
right? However, as you build out your charging depots so that you can control how the vehicles are charged, we will then move to the second class of charging infrastructure rollout, which you will see done in partnership with supermarkets and malls, gas stations, certain restaurants and hotels, certain institutions where the private user or a public transport operator with an emergency need to charge can then go charge.
That's right.
But first level is depots, so you won't see them. It doesn't mean they don't exist. We're bringing an additional 50 buses, as a matter of fact, 160 buses this year. And we're already, building out a charging depot that will service those buses. And then we're bringing in electric vehicles for taxi hailing services as well. And they will have a separate charging center, because they consume energy differently and the infrastructure they require, vary. So essentially, long answer to a short question, absolutely there's a plan to build our charging infrastructure as we roll out electric vehicles. Please recognize conclusively, what we set out to do in Oando Clean Energy is to build the next downstream sector for e-mobility. We've done it with internal combustion engine vehicles, been there, done that, got a t-shirt and a medal. Now we're building the next one for e-mobility. The reason we're investing in the vehicles is so that we can at least pull the trigger on demand for the infrastructure that we're building. At some point, we'll build strictly charging infrastructure and hands off
leave the
asset acquisition on the vehicle side.
Someone is asking, and I think this is from Eve, should Nigeria be burning scarce forex? Are we burning forex?
It's a productivity conversation, but also a consumption conversation. So when you delay our consumption and then you juxtapose it with our productivity, that's where the conversation really is. So why do I need to buy anything from outside of Nigeria and pay dollars for it if my consumption is local? And my consumption can only be local if my local environment can produce what I consume. If it can't produce what I consume, I either curtail my consumption or I keep going out. Or I start to build local capacity, and which were the elements that he delayed in his response. So it's literally a consumption and productivity conversation.
30 seconds. What kind of urban mobility future do you envisage for Nigeria?
Interestingly, I'm not a fan of three-wheelers. It actually rouses me, somewhat gets me emotional when I hear about a transport system for this country that is centered around three-wheelers, and then the justification is, our demographics very similar to that of India. Three-wheelers are thriving in India. Who says I want to be compared to India? Right? Why can't I be better? Why can't it be a transport system that's similar to what you find in Scandinavia? Right? It's rail, it's road, and it's four-wheelers or scooters or two-wheelers, but no three-wheelers, right? And it's waterways. It's the fancy stuff that I want for my people, and that's the future that I see. And the reason we cannot give up on government is whether they're leading us or we're pulling them along, they regulate us.
True. Absolutely.
So whilst I am big on design, particularly when you design societies in a way where people can walk, ride bicycles. I love it. I studied urban and regional planning for my first degree. So that's what I want to see as well. But even with that, you need government. So whilst you can look at Yaba, design it, you can't implement it without taking it to them, making them a disciple, and saying, let's do this.
We are the government.
Yeah, exactly. And I was saying that to you earlier, that you have got to just be in that game with them.
Yeah.
You know, leading them
At the
where you
local
must.
level, we are the government.
Yes.
Once it gets to Alausa, we don't know who the government is.
And that's where implementation happens.
Yeah, that's it.
You understand?
No, but it shouldn't happen there. It should happen
At the local level.
But they will regulate it, is my point. So what I'm responding to is, to me's response earlier saying, it's done with government. You can't be. You just have to stay with them and continue to influence them and work with them. Motivate them even, right? Because we need them. And then you go run for office.
Run for office, not too
Run for
young
office.
to run.
At all.
Hashtag.
After all, you're now OON.